I think the NHS could create massively greater patient satisfaction by deploying certain behaviours and techniques.
Like what?
Well,
Rory Sutherland.
He is an author, columnist, and the vice chairman of Ogilvy UK.
One of the largest marketing companies in the world. He's an ad man.
stories are the PDF files of human information. They're the vehicle we use for storing information and the vehicle we use for sharing it. If you want to improve how people feel, psychology is a better area for exploration than rational improvement. Don't make the Eurostar faster, make the journey more enjoyable. And that's one of the cleverest reframings you can do. The Uber map is a psychological moonshot. What bothers us about waiting for a taxi isn't actually the duration, it's the degree of uncertainty. And if you have a map which shows you where the taxi is, you're basically relaxed. You can genuinely perform magic in perception. What is the seat covering for the Tesla? It's called vegan leather. Now, actually, to be honest, we would have called those plastic seats back in the day. If it makes things feel more valuable, is it a con?
Without further ado, I'm Stephen Bartlett, and this is The Diary of a CEO. I hope nobody's listening, but if you are, then please keep this to yourself. Rory, first of all, thank you for being here. As someone who built a marketing business and has worked in a sort of similar industry to you for a huge portion of my life, you're someone that I've always looked up to, and even young members of my team here cite you as being an inspiration on an ongoing basis for the work they're doing, just broadly on some, even of these new platforms like TikTok, because the principles and the psychology and the sort of rationality underneath much of your work is really, really timeless. So thank you for being here.
That's a great honour.
Oh, no worries.
And we'll get into some mutual fanboying later. But no, I mean, one of the great insights, I think, which I hope helps motivate everybody working in our industry and related industries, is that when you create perceptual value, you are creating value. Value can be created in the mind every bit as much as it can be created in the factory. Mm-hmm. And I think there was an unfortunate story about marketing that treated it as a kind of optional extra. It was the fairy dust on top of the real intrinsic value that resided in a product or service. Mm-hmm. And I completely dispute that. I think we value things according not to what they are, but what they mean. And what they mean is context dependent. It can be massively transformed by storytelling, framing, recontextualization. And you can absolutely use psychological mechanisms to make things more valuable, more enjoyable, more precious. That's one important point. I might make the additional point, which is, to be honest, over-ambitious, but I make it anyway, which is that actually perceived value is a very environmentally friendly form of value to create. Because you can generally create meaning and imbue a product with meaning with a lot less carbon consumption than is necessarily involved in making the product 3 times bigger or 5 times faster. And, you know, my argument would also be, if we're looking for breakthrough 10x moonshot improvements, it's actually much easier to find psychological moonshots than technological moonshots. You know, making a train 10 times faster, you know, it was possible in 1840, 1820, okay? It's very difficult to do now. To a point of just dangerousness or, you know, extraordinarily difficult engineering problem. Making a train journey 10 times more enjoyable, that's still doable, in my view.
Give me an example then. What's the example that always comes to mind for you of where someone has managed to put tremendous moonshot style value on something, a brand potentially, just with marketing and advertising?
But what I'm always very fond of is, I think, the Uber map is a psychological moonshot. And it's based, I mean, the story, which may or may not be true, is that one of the founders of Uber was inspired by watching Goldfinger. And when he saw Bond effectively following Goldfinger using a tracking device, there was a scrolling map in the dashboard of the DB4 which showed him where Goldfinger's car was so he could trail it while remaining out of sight. What was extraordinary about that was that it was based on a very clever insight into human psychology, which most of us ourselves aren't really aware of, which is we would say, and we'd confidently say we believe, that I hate it when a taxi takes a long time to turn up. I like it when a taxi turns up quickly. So a rational person or an engineer would react to that by saying what we need is a predictive algorithm so that taxis tend to be available in areas where we predict heavy demand so that we can service customers more quickly. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that. It may be a very worthwhile thing to do, although it's worth saying that it requires quite a lot of scale in order to achieve that. But the real insight with a map is that deep down, somewhere in the amygdala, what bothers us about waiting for a taxi isn't actually the duration, it's the degree of uncertainty. In other words, is he here yet? Maybe he's parked round the corner. Oh, what if he can't find the house? Maybe he's already left. Was the person on the phone lying? And so that period between booking a taxi and waiting for it to arrive was one of general high stress. Now, what's interesting is you could reduce that stress, I admit, by getting the taxi to turn up very quickly. Or at least you'd reduce the period of stress, but the stress would still remain. On the other hand, if you have a map which shows you where the taxi is, you're basically relaxed, okay? Instead of going, oh my God, where is he? Where is he? I'm sure, maybe he's already left. I better go and stand out in the rain so he doesn't miss me or get impatient. You just look at the map and you go, oh, look, he's stuck at those traffic lights. I'll have another pint. Okay, now what's interesting is that the quantity of waiting is the same with or without a map. In pure quantitative measured SI unit terms of time and duration, no difference. The quality of the waiting is totally transformed.
It's almost taking it from a system dependent on trust, how much you trust that particular firm, how have they performed in the past, do they sometimes lie to me, have other taxi drivers sometimes lied to me, to a system that is almost completely trustless, where I don't need to trust you because I can see for myself.
And I suppose there's also an element of trust which, was provided historically in London by the knowledge. And the knowledge was an interesting thing because I occasionally debate this, which is, was the knowledge really about knowledge? In other words, we don't need black cab drivers to study to this level of detail. Now we have the technology of the sat-nav.
Yeah.
And pure sort of utilitarian people go, why on earth am I paying a premium for a black cab driver to learn all this stuff when he could simply buy a TomTom for 300 quid and stick it on the dashboard? And there's some argument for that, okay? The only other point is that you have a very high degree of trust. One of the great things you could say about the knowledge is its sunk cost. It's proof of commitment. You're only going to actually go through that process if you're pretty serious about being a really good cab driver. Also, it provides you, if you think about it, if you've spent, a year and a half, 2 years scuttling around London on a moped with one of those clipboards, rehearsing for your sessions of the knowledge, okay, you'd be a bit of an idiot effectively losing your taxi license day one, wouldn't you? Okay? In other words, it is to something, it's rather like medieval guilds. They required extraordinary stringent conditions of entry into the guild, but that was what ensured honesty. Because the cost of being thrown out of the guild, given the effort you'd put into actually being admitted in the first place, was therefore made it not worthwhile to cheat.
You also say something in your book about how making a process more difficult can sometimes make it more attractive to consumers.
This is known sometimes as the IKEA effect, which is that certainly Kamprad, who's the kind of owner and founder of IKEA, believes that the fact that you assemble the furniture yourself contributes to its perceived value. In other words, you've committed something of yourself to its assembly and creation. You might also argue it destigmatizes low prices. Okay? So I'll give you an example of that. There's a very big difference between cheap strawberries and pick your own strawberries. Now, pick your own strawberries are cheap, but there's a narrative as to why they're cheap, which is I put into some of the effort into the harvesting of the things, and I have to go out into a field and pick the things myself. Cheap strawberries, by contrast, may create some degree of uncertainty because you look at the market and go, well, if these strawberries were really good, why wouldn't they charge full price for them? What's wrong with this? And so quite often, sometimes you have to make things more expensive to make them trustworthy, oddly, okay? You can be too good to be true, that consumers won't necessarily trust something that's cheap unless there's a narrative around it as to where the cost savings are made. I think a lot of, if you think about low-cost airlines, okay, they spent quite a lot of effort talking about what you didn't get. You don't get a meal, okay? You have to pay to check in your luggage. You don't get it originally with EasyJet. You didn't even get pre-allocated seating, Okay, it was, effectively like a bus. You had to book online, you couldn't book through a travel agent. And those constraints, to some extent, were there to make it believable to the consumer that there was a legitimate form of cost saving going on. Now, if you'd launched EasyJet and you'd said, we're just as good as British Airways, but we're half the price, the untrusting consumer is going to ask, how are you doing this? Okay. Does it mean you're not servicing the engines, or the pilots are all on day release from prison or something, right? You're going to start having doubts. So interestingly, sometimes negative stories around a product can be used to offset the negatives which a consumer would tend to imagine. If IKEA had ready assembled furniture which wasn't sold in a warehouse, it was sold in a kind of posh Heels style emporium, we'd think there was something a bit iffy going on. So, and there's also the wonderful IKEA effect, which is the effort of actually going to an IKEA and navigating the maze makes it more or less impossible for you to go home empty-handed. You have to buy some tea lights at the very minimum just to validate your trip. Now, I suppose the earliest manifestation of this, although it's sometimes called the IKEA effect, was a very famous marketing case study for Betty Crocker cakes, where they had a cake mix where you just added water, put it in the oven, created a cake. And it didn't sell very well, and a psychologist came in and said, there isn't enough effort involved in this to make it feel like cooking. And so they added the slogan, just add an egg. The addition of the egg, although it actually imposed a cost and a small degree of effort, suddenly made the product much more popular.
Why?
Now, the idea would be that now it was actually cooking. You were preparing something for your family. You weren't just cheating. Perhaps. I mean, it's an interesting debate because we don't fully know that this wasn't tested to an absolutely robust level of academic certainty, but nonetheless, it's a very popular anecdote within marketing that sometimes the counterintuitive, I think that's all you need to derive from it, okay? All you need to derive from it in business decision making is sometimes the counterintuitive approach might be better.
And this, I was thinking then about these modern sort of meal delivery companies. So you have, obviously, on one end, super convenience. You have Uber yep. Eats, etc., delivery. And then you have this middle ground of where we'll send you the ingredients and tell you how to put it in the pan. And we'll measure
So that would be Gusto or HelloFresh. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
But you just got to put it in the pan and mix it. And it will only take you 10 minutes or so, which I think is kind of probably appealing to the same sort of psychological desire to feel like you cooked.
It's a very strange thing because one of the founders of Gusto actually met me shortly before lockdown. And I couldn't really make sense of the product, okay, at first. And this, by the way, really interests me because Bill Gates once said of technology that the problem we have with technology is people don't know how to want the things we can offer them. And one of the things that increasingly fascinates me is products which an economist would call them an experience good, where it's only really possible to perceive their value by actually using them. And I have to admit, when I was presented with Gusto and HelloFresh, I thought, this is kind of dumb. I've got an Ocado account. I can order things from Sainsbury's for click and collect. I've got, well, my wife, more accurately, has got 20 or 30 cookery books of various kinds. All I have to do is pick a recipe from a cookery book, effectively order the necessary ingredients, follow instructions, cook at home, job done. Why on earth would I want a box with, pre-selected ingredients in the right ratio arriving with a recipe card? But anyway, I met this guy and he said, look, I'll send you a free box. Now, I'm not so, ungrateful and nasty a human being that I go, I don't want your stinking box of free food. And I think it was actually towards the beginning of the pandemic anyway, so I wasn't entirely sure that food was going to remain abundantly available. So I said, sure, absolutely, I'm delighted. The other thing is I probably ordered a Gusto box for... the only reason we stopped was actually we had our kitchen replaced and had a period without an oven. But pretty much every week, my assistant Anna, who's in the next room, has also had a Gusto the majority of weeks for 2.5 years, ever since experiencing it. You asked me to explain this. I mean, this is what's so glorious, which is I can't quite explain why once experienced, this is such a compelling benefit.
Try.
Okay. It possibly is the fact that because these ingredients are in the right ratio and have a limited shelf life, it forces you to cook them. And therefore it forces you to cook what ends up being a restaurant quality meal at home with not too much effort, okay? In, by the way, a reasonably healthy quantity as well. One of the problems with takeaway food is if you want variety, you end up with completely excessive quantity, don't you? You end up either keeping the stuff in the fridge or with an extraordinary amount of food waste. Because unlike a restaurant where they think, well, if we give them slightly too little food, they might order a pudding or something else. In takeaway food, you don't get a second chance to top them up. So the great paranoia, I think, of all takeaway restaurants is not putting enough quantity in. And so you do end up with a restaurant quality meal at the price of a ready meal, which you have cooked yourself.
That's very logical. Though. Give me the illogical. Was there some surprise and delight in?
I genuinely, I don't. I mean, I've just got one product, okay, which is the greatest example of a product which genuinely kind of creates massive contradictions in my own mind, which is the cooker. I don't know if you've got one of instant boiling water, effectively.
Oh yeah, I've got one.
Yeah, you've got one over there. Yeah. If you want the story of the cooker, by the way, I'll tell your listeners because it's fascinating. There were two people, I think, at Unilever who their brief was effectively to invent cuppa soup, and they did it very successfully. They produced what is a powdered form of soup. And one of them said, right, job done. We've created the cuppa soup, boil a kettle, pour the water on. You've got a nice mug of soup. Job done. I'll go back to the day job. And the other Dutch guy basically felt, no, I've only solved half the problem here because you still have to wait for the kettle to boil. And for whatever reason, I mean, he must have been a kind of compulsive inventor, he became obsessed with solving the second half of the cuppa soup problem, which is how can we create boiling water faster? Which was technically off brief, but nonetheless, for some reason, absolutely preoccupied him. And so he effectively ended up creating what is a Dutch company, Quooker. Now, okay, half of me, perhaps the more puritanical, rational half, is going, you've just paid not quite a 4-figure sum, but a very large 3-figure sum for a very fast kettle. Yeah. And the other half of me is going, I wouldn't go back. I don't know what your relationship is with your cooker, but I'd find it difficult now going back to a kettle, having experienced instant tea making, instant soup making. If you want to poach an egg, you can fill a pan with boiling water instantaneously. You don't have to wait for that to cook up. Suddenly, of course, you discover new and complementary uses for boiling water.
That all seems very logical to me. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing is, I think you've got a lot of products which are much, much easier for you to defend or understand or appreciate in retrospect than they are for you to write a check for in advance.
Right, I've got you.
And that's a marketing problem. The electric car, by the way, one really interesting question I always ask about any technology, which I think is a question that's asked too little. People ask, what are the unit sales of this technology and how fast are they growing? Actually, any new technology grows very slowly to begin with. It's a sigmoid curve. Nearly anything significantly new starts off fairly niche.
Yeah.
And the reason is that the two driving forces of human behavior are habit and social copying. And therefore, when you've never done it before and none of your friends do it, doing something is much more difficult to do. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the time when the majority of my friends said, I don't understand why you'd want a mobile phone, okay? I mean, I can actually remember when I used a mobile phone on Oxford Street in 1989. 2 people shouted abuse at me from passing taxis. It was like a brick. Right. It was a social statement. It wasn't my phone. We had company phones and we signed them out for the day. But just the act of using one of these things in public would expose you to a general opprobrium. I mean, it's impossible for anybody now to think back on that because I don't think anybody knows anybody without a mobile phone.
The example that comes to mind for me, and it's also to do with a cooker. I didn't call it a cooker. I just call it the tap. But yeah, instant hot water and instant cold water is music. And a friend of mine told me the story of standing with the HMV, I think it's HMV CEO, looking out on the shop floor at all these people buying CDs. And he said to him, we'll always have a business because people love music. Now, what he got wrong is he was right that people love music, but they don't love getting in their car, driving in the rain, and then getting a piece of plastic, which they can then get damaged very easily. They can only carry a few of them and driving it back to the house. People loved music. And he only really found
But they didn't
that out.
really like CDs.
Yes.
I might make a point, by the way, that in terms of its if someone has a design sensibility, in terms of its proliferation, the CD, laughably named jewel case, the plastic hinged case in which the CD came, was probably the nastiest single manufactured item in everything from environmental terms to just usability. The fact that it opened with a horrible sort of cracking snap. Now, what's interesting is that vinyl has made a resurgence, but I don't see any sign of a CD resurgence any more than I see. There are a few weird people who are back into cassettes, aren't there? But I think that's fairly nichey.
Yeah, I mean really.
That's kind of like lomography and photography. It's one of those sort of weird countercultures. But I can understand. I can just about understand. It's slightly weird when my daughter asked for a gramophone player for her birthday, because I'm kind of going. I was born in 1965. I spent my whole life trying to get rid of the nuisance of physical music to, effectively something akin to Spotify, and now you're weirdly reverting to this thing. It made no sense to me. Possibly there's an element that if you're really devoted to a particular band, you want to spend money and signal your devotion in some physical form. I don't know what's going on there fully.
I think, is that not just a case of like scarcity?
Yeah, I suspect one of the curses of capitalism is recursive fashion.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Jeremy Bullmore, who's now, I suppose, in his late 80s, wonderful guy who was the creative director of J. Walter Thompson. He was a director of WPP for many years. He made the point, and by the way, as you get older, you realise much more of this. Here we go again. Because you have greater chronological context in which to appreciate it. But he made the point that when he was a child, all cheddar cheese came with a rind. So most cheese you buy in a shop was cut from a wheel, and it would have either some sort of wax or else rind, or sometimes it's cloth on the exterior. And someone then started selling rindless cheddar, and they charged a premium for it, you see? Because, oh, brilliant, I don't have to pay for the rind and I don't have to cut it off. What a wonderful convenience. And then memories being short, and obviously some people being born before they could remember cheddar with a rind anyway, about 25, 30 years after that, people started introducing farmhouse artisan cheddar with the rind left on, and they charged a premium for that. So you do have this peculiar thing where...
that's all marketing, though, isn't it? Advertising. Because what you're saying, that's the real cheese.
It's partly human neophilia, so that what's different attracts our attention. Okay, so undoubtedly we disproportionately pay attention to things which are new or seemingly different, and we're novelty seeking to a great extent.
What is the story though? If I buy that artisanal cheese, the story for me, especially it being artisan, is this is the real cheese. In my head, I immediately go, that supermarket stuff is just fake processed, but the rind signals that this I'm paying for real cheese.
Well, I mean, we can look at the interesting. Exactly, it's a recursive trend.
Yeah.
And of course, in fashion, it happens all the time. That the most bizarre fashions, including sort of flares and Afghan coats, and sequins, have made a massive comeback. And and the truth is that when they come around a second time, the context is different, so they mean something different.
You see the same with brands like Fila. Like these old brands have exploded. Fila's a good example where it became, when I was 10 years old, but if you bought Fila, you had no money and you weren't cool.
No.
When I was 20, if you had Fila, you were the coolest person. Burberry had that as well. They went from being, oh, if you're wearing Burberry, you are a bit of a roughie, right? You're a little bit rough as a person, to this kind of, I guess it was a branding exercise where Burberry then became really cool again, maybe because of
So part of the term for this is sometimes counter-signalling. It was a bit like hipsters drinking Pabst Blue Ribbon, I think it's called, which is it was historically down-market blue-collar American beer.
Right, okay.
Okay, it was down-market of kind of Budweiser and the other, and Coors and so forth. And this is a really interesting thing in human behavior, sometimes in marketing itself, but also in how humans market themselves. Because I think one of the conclusions we've got to come to, and we have to admit, and which the better understanding of will be, I think, central to understanding how we solve things like the environmental crisis and indeed overconsumption, is that the human brain itself has quite a large marketing function. It has an accounting function. It cares about the efficient use of resources. It has, all kinds of kind of algorithms and heuristics that are kind of in many cases innate and built in. But it also has a marketing function. It very much cares about image and status. Effectively, what something you do means to other people. Now, one thing that is common to lots of animals is signaling. The most common example is the peacock's tail, elk's antlers, things you do, often costly things you do, to demonstrate that you can do them.
Ferraris.
Okay. And, in many cases, Ferraris in London, of course. Yeah. The extraordinary thing when you think about it is having a Ferrari in central London is about as deranged a car choice as you can imagine. Okay. But the very fact that it's impractical and ludicrous is almost what gives it meaning. Okay. As I said, if this is a very mischievous sentence, but if people were attracted to people who drove expensive vehicles, okay, then they'd find lorry drivers more attractive than Ferrari owners in many cases, because the truck is actually more expensive as a vehicle or a really luxury motor coach. But the motor coach actually has a practical function which diminishes its signaling value, because if you want to show that you really have resources to spare, nothing beats waste. Indiscriminate waste shows that you really have resources to spare, or you pursue things that are disproportionately scarce. The really interesting thing with humans, though, and I don't think there's a case where animals do this, is they also practice something called counter-signaling, which is showing that you don't have to try because you're confident enough in your other attributes. Okay, so an example of that would be in academia, a professor who's aspiring to get let's say, a named professorship or tenure will go around in a suit, okay? A tenured professor who has job security for life will go around dressed like a tramp. If you've won a Nobel Prize, my hunch is, once you've won a Nobel Prize, I think famously George Stiglitz used to actually turn up at the World Bank with no shoes on, okay? Now, interestingly, you do that. It's a bit like that old joke, why do dogs lick their own balls? Because they can, okay? And to some extent, people do what they can get away with. So, the classic example is, people who play in very fashionable bands can afford to be extraordinarily scruffy, because what effectively Liam and Noel are saying is that our presence in this band renders us so unbelievably cool and sexy that we don't even have to make an effort on the sartorial front.
I've seen this in my own life. It's funny, just through the journey of my career in the last 10 years, the example I'd give is in my early career speaking on stage, I would try and dress really smart and wear a suit. Now, I think it's much better that I present myself in the tracksuit bottom, in the tracksuit that I would wear, like going around the house when I speak on stage. A, because it's more akin to who I am. B, because I can. And C, I think the psychological thing that I'm not admitting, because it might make me seem like an arsehole, is it's actually more of a status play to not wear a suit and to not show off. And the same applies for Louis Vuitton. Like, early part of my first 5 years of my career, when I was just about getting some money, I'd buy these designer brands like Louis Vuitton. Now, I genuinely think if I hold a Louis Vuitton bag, it makes me look bad. So I've like rid myself. And when I walk in somewhere, I say to my manager, because I've just got the one left that hasn't managed to break yet, I say, can you hold that? Because I don't want to be associated with that level of signaling, if that makes sense, I guess.
No, and the argument is that you are famous enough now that you no longer need fashion brands to accord, in fact, the very fact that you are trying, given your fame, to actually signal your success through fashion would probably be counterproductive. It would suggest you are insecure or trying too hard. And so that thing of we do what we can get away with to signal what we're capable of. So it's a very oblique form of status signaling. It might be very valuable environmentally. Counter signaling might be something you need to harness. In other words, it's cool. It's cool to own less.
Yes, because I don't have things. I don't have a watch. I don't have, as I said to you, I have an electric bike, which you've just seen. Like, to be fair, I do have a nice car that they drive me in sometimes. But other than that, in terms of my own possessions, it's really all about utility and not buying it in excess. And I actually think that's a really good point, that can be leveraged to try and help the environment, But I think that's happening anyway.
There's a very interesting thing happening, which is in electric cars. When I was speaking to the marketing director of Skoda, they produce something called the Enyaq, which is actually, it's similar to the Volkswagen ID4, but it's a very, very good electric car. And one of the things they're noticing, I migrated from a Jaguar to the Ford Mustang Mach-E. Quite a few people on the Mackie forum are actually ex-luxury car owners. And quite a few people, the Skoda marketing director was telling me, that quite a few people who'd gone to the Skoda Enyaq had actually come from, for example, Audi, Jaguar, fairly premium cars. So there is a thing that actually having the electric car, even in a less leather-clad, walnut-infested form, that's now the status component.
100%.
It's not the brand of the car; it's the fact that it's electric.
Tesla's the same. I think of Tesla as a big. I don't give a fuck. In a weird way, I think it's a big. For me, it's a. The journey, honestly, would be you'd get a if you were insecure and this is what you're into. You'd get one of those really fancy brands, and then the next step is saying, do you know what? I don't give a fuck, which is what you see going on in San Francisco with the billionaires and the CEOs and the VCs. I'm going to be a Tesla person now, which is I care more about the environment and other things, and I don't really care if you think
it's still a premium brand. I mean, let's be honest, because let's face it, any Tesla is probably less than 3 years old, and actually, most people don't buy cars from new ever or only once in their life.
It's not fancy though,
but it's not particularly fancy. I mean, there's a wonderful piece of little alchemy in it, of course, which is the invention of the phrase vegan leather.
Oh, really?
If you think the reason I wrote the book Alchemy is partly to elevate the status and centrality of marketing in business success. That actually what you are is effectively a product of how you make people feel. Okay, ultimately. And that's psychological, it's not technological, and therefore, if you want to improve how people feel, psychology is a better area for exploration than what you might call rational improvement. Don't make the Eurostar faster, make the journey more enjoyable. Okay, put Wi-Fi on the trains, serve better food, okay? It's a cheaper way, actually, to compete. Okay, strangely, engineers see it as cheating. You see, if you have an engineering or a finance background, you see psychological value as invalid. But the vital thing about psychological value is, whereas it's very difficult to perform magic in the world of physics or engineering, you can genuinely perform magic in perception. Now, what is the seat covering for the Tesla? It's called vegan leather. Now, actually, to be honest, we would have called those plastic seats back in the day. In my childhood in the 1970s and 80s, we were going, it's got plastic seats, okay? Now, I'm sure that vegan leather is better than the plastic seats which you'd find in a Vauxhall Viva in 1977, okay? I'm sure it's better in all kinds of ways, breathability, cleanliness, whatever. But nonetheless, calling it vegan leather, in other words, I'm doing this for the planet rather than plastic, which is, in other words, what you're doing there is you're making it a choice, not a compromise.
Yeah.
And that's one of the cleverest reframings you can do.
An aspirational choice as well.
And indeed, so and so I look at things like range anxiety, and I go, that's psychological. Okay,
what's that?
Okay, range anxiety is a big obstacle to electric car purchase. In the UK, in two levels. Okay, three levels. One, it means that cars tend to compete on their range, which in a sense is further emphasising a negative to the consumer, because if electric car advertising is all about range, okay, people start to see range as more of a problem than it is. Secondly, it makes the batteries bigger, the cars heavier and more expensive than they probably need to be. So it's interesting because so often I think the obstacles to technology adoption are really psychological hurdles, much more than technological hurdles. This is why I think marketing is so fascinating, because there are these products exactly like Gusto or HelloFresh, which once you experience them, 50% of people become a convert. But the real marketing challenge is, well, that's fine, that's great, but how on earth do you convert people in the first place? And that's a very interesting case where after the pandemic, and this is, I think, the value, I think there's a multiple value to having occasional disruptions in life. One of which is that businesses become much less risk averse when they're facing a crisis. Mm-hmm. It's a necessity as the mother of invention. But consumers also have a narrative for why they're doing things differently. I mean, in a way, you could, if you looked at the whole path of human history, the 1930s in the United States, i.e. the decade immediately after the Great Depression, was probably the period of greatest innovation in terms of human welfare in everything from cars, aircraft, etc. It was an extraordinary period of innovation. And yet it came on the heels of this total economic disaster. And I think there is something there in that idea that it's almost like annealing when you make a samurai sword. You actually bang the thing while it's cooling. That actually some periods of disruption, that some degree of variance and instability in economies is possibly long-term healthy. I mean, I'm a huge devotee, more so than you. I mean, I know you've got a very intelligent approach to flexible working, which is...
Yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about. Is
Yeah. But